Hey, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started because I know we want to really appreciate everybody for joining us today for our Nebraska Cattlemen's Cattle Edge Producer Education webinar. My name is Benita Lettier. I am the Director of Producer Education with the Nebraska Cattlemen, and we are excited to kick off 2026 by hosting a Cattle Edge webinar. And today our partner is Ward Lab. I just want to let everybody know that we plan on having our Cattle Edge webinars monthly. So watch for updates as we work with our allied industry individuals to offer you some educational webinars. Just a couple of things the Nebraska Cattlemen are currently working on, legislative and regulatory affairs, producer education programs, and we want to hear from you on what we need to be doing with your membership dollars. So please don't be afraid to give us a call, drop us an email, and let us know how we can work better for you and engage you more with the Nebraska Cattlemen. I also want to let you know that if you are a member, and you should be receiving an email from us every other week, giving you updates on what we are doing. If you are not receiving this, please let us know and we will track down why you are not getting this. And make sure you're following us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Couple things for housekeeping today. If you do have any questions for our speakers, use the Q&A box. We will watch those and get those answered as we can. If we don't get them along the way, we will make sure that we get them answered at the end of our webinar. If you have any problems throughout the day, throughout the webinar, please text me. My number is 402-450-0223. And we will be recording this and we will load it up on our website so you can watch it later. Before we begin our presentation from Ward Lab, I've invited Connor Beeler to jump on the call here quick. He's going to give us an update on a project that he's got going on. He would love to share this with you. His contact information is there, so give him a call if you have any questions.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. And I first just want to say thank you to Benita and Nebraska Cattlemen's for giving me the opportunity to come on here and talk about the second year of a program that we started called the Midwest Feeds Practicum. And FEED stands for Forage Education and Efficiency in Diversified Systems. And I'm sure some of you on this call have heard of the Nebraska Ranch Practicum. It's got a history of about 25 years of the program going on. And when I first started, some other educators and I decided that we thought that, that was a great program that they have out on the western side of the state that takes place at the Goodmanson Sandhills Laboratory near Whitman. And we wanted to do something that was more advantageous to the producers on the eastern side of the state. And so we developed this hands-on learning program to help the producers leverage their unique advantages of living and farming in the upper Midwest by integrating crop and livestock systems in a cohesive and efficient manner. And so this is a 5 session program that spans across the production system, going through each stage of the production system and a cow calf and row crop operation. And we start in February and end in December. And all sessions take place at the Eastern Nebraska Research Extension and Education Center near Mead, which is about 30 miles north of Lincoln. And so we look at different topics ranging from animal health to cattle marketing to forage managing. And each session has a theme. And so this, if you guys can see the website now, Benita, could you give me a thumbs up that you see that? Um, so this is the website and the QR code that was on the flyer. If you scan that, it'll take you directly to the website. And here are some of our themes for each session. So in February, we'll be talking about health, nutrition, and systems thinking. And Jay Parsons uses the King Ranch method of systems thinking. And so we go through some of that. And then in March, we talk about forage systems and breeding. In June, we go over facilities and pasture management. And then in August, we talk about weaning, culling, and winter feeding. And then finally, we wrap up in the last session by talking about stock grazing and preparing for calving. And so, what we kind of think makes this program unique is that we try to minimize PowerPoints and do the maximum amount of hands-on learning that we possibly can. We want to create a co-learning environment where the participants and the instructors can share their ideas and experiences, and everybody learns from one another. And so we spend plenty of time in the field and by the chute, processing cattle, looking at different things, and applying these concepts directly to real world situations. Now I know, we're not going to have good weather every time we meet, so we do have quite a few indoor activities, but those are more like small group type work. And you generally come to an extension program and they give you a fictional ranch, a fictional scenario, um, and they ask you to apply that in hopes that you'll learn. And one thing we actually do is we ask the participants to provide examples from their own operations. And so we do have homework between every session. Some of that is generally pretty simple. It's not like it's for a grade or going to reflect, passing or failing this. But some of those, we have them do forage tests and they bring in their results, and we talk about developing grazing plans. We also have them take pictures of their facilities and look over, this is what I like about it, this is what I don't. And these aren't, really nice silencer shoots. This is, people making what they have work and sharing those ideas so that people can. So that the other participants or instructors can take from that and learn from one another. One activity that the participants the first year really liked was we would have them take pictures of their cows and do body condition scoring. And so we'd have them take a picture of their thinnest and their heaviest and kind of what they considered their most middle of the road as far as condition goes. And those are just a few examples of some of the different things we do. But the main idea is to create an environment where the instructors and attendees can learn. And we want to create an environment that leaves everybody with actionable strategies and ways that they can improve their operations. So the main objectives of this are to equip the producers with decision-making tools to optimize nutrition and forage use, also to develop effective grazing and pasture management plans, improve breeding, calving, and weaning practices, and also to teach how to evaluate cattle performance and nutritional needs throughout the production cycle and as the needs of the cow and the calf change throughout the year. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to contact me. My number is 402-624-8007. You can also reach me by email or look me up. My name is Connor Beeler, and you can also look up the Midwest Feeds Practicum, and that should take you right to the site. So once again, thank you, Benita, and thank you everybody for letting me be on here and talk about this program today.
Thank
Do
you,
we have
Connor.
any
Appreciate it.
questions?
Thank you, Connor. Appreciate it. So we're going to go ahead and turn the screen over to Rebecca. Rebecca Kern-Lunberry is the feed testing product manager at Ward Labs, overseeing quality control, consultation, sales, and marketing for the feed testing department. You'll find her in several magazines. She's a prolific writer and she regularly contributes to Progressive Forage and the Nebraska Farmer. So we're really happy to have her today because she's dedicated to producer education and collaborating with state extensions and the Nebraska Cattlemen to make sure that we're staying current on current issues. So thank you, Rebecca. And just to let you guys know, she's got about 30 minutes of a presentation. And again, just a reminder, if you have a question, type it in that Q&A. We'll try and catch it, or we'll make sure we get it at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonita, and thanks for having us on. So I was actually pretty excited when Bonita was looking for someone to kind of restart this Cattle's Edge webinar, because I do have a message that I think is really important for cattlemen this year, specifically in Nebraska. You know, we have become so accustomed to droughts, and I think everyone knows during a drought we need to be testing our hay for nitrates. We need to be aware of nitrates when we are grazing. We need to be aware of prussic acid, and we're aware of those kinds of things. And I think that you know, there's tons of resources, myself included. I've produced our extension is great and has produced tons of nitrate resources, but we don't talk a lot about what happens during a wet haying season and a wet growing season, and what are the differences of what we need to be looking for on our forage reports. What do we need to be testing? It is still really important to test to make sure that we're going to be able to meet our animal production and health goals. Let's see, it's not, there we go. So today, the first thing I'm going to be talking about is understanding rained on or put up wet hay. I got a lot of calls about this over this past haying season, and I think here in Nebraska, we're not quite as used to it. I know Connor spent some time out in Tennessee. I have some other colleagues in Tennessee and Kentucky who, you know, haylage has become a big thing out in those parts because they are used to having to deal with rained on hay and putting things up wetter than they would like. But we don't have that flexibility around here. So we need to understand what's going on with our hay and our stored forages when these kinds of seasons do happen. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how this extra moisture has possibly provided some additional grazing. But I know in the past several months now, we've not had a lot of moisture. So that maybe has changed a bit, but it's still a relevant topic to talk about some winter grazing opportunities that may have come up for you guys. And then Ward Labs recently did expand our mycotoxin testing capabilities, specifically in grains. Of course, corn grain is the biggest thing grown in our area. And we've unfortunately, with this wet growing season, seen a rise in different mycotoxin levels. And it's not just aflatoxin, the big one that everyone likes to talk about. So that's kind of where we're going with this presentation. So the first thing I want to talk about is rained on hay. So I'm going to go over moisture, considerations with moisture, protein, fibers, soluble carbohydrates, and micronutrients, and what differences you might want to be looking at, and especially kind of red flagging as you're looking at your hay analysis from this year. Especially if you know you had to put hay up a little wetter than you typically would like. So I always like to share this slide whenever we talk about dry matter and moisture. This was actually a bunk that caught on fire here close to Kearney. So the Kearney volunteer fire department responded. Of course, you don't ever want to see these guys on your place. So the risk for spontaneous combustion is typically the number one concern I get when producers see their report and they see higher moisture levels. So this typically is going to happen at over 22% moisture. Optimal moisture for hay is 18 to 22, or is 14 to 18. And we can still see the heating risk without necessarily spontaneous combustion when it's above 18%. So anybody who's got a report and it's above 18%, you're really going to want to pay attention to the things I'm going to be going over next, specifically how heat can impact protein availability. Okay, so heat damaged protein is the biggest concern outside of spontaneous combustion. And so if you do have hay over 22%, don't stack it. Leave those bales spread as much as you can. We're kind of past the point in this season where people are, thinking about doing those kinds of things. So, but heat damage protein within those bales that are above 18% moisture, basically what happens is the microbes become very active because they have the two things they need. They have oxygen because we're not in haylage, we're not sealed in creating an anaerobic, high acidic environment. So they have oxygen and they have good pH. And then they also have plenty of water available to them. So the microbial activity increases. They put off a lot of heat, and that triggers what's called a Maillard reaction, which is when the proteins bind to the fibrous portions of the feed. So that protein that's bound to the fibrous portion of the feed is no longer available to the animal. So on our forage report, we're going to want to look at heat damage protein, and that's something that we actually added to our reports this year, along with available protein to help producers navigate this unusually wet haying season. So again, heat damage protein is the protein associated with the fiber. And so depending how much heat damage protein there is going to determine how much of that is actually available for the animal. And so we have these equations. Of course, your producers, you don't need to worry about these equations. The lab covers this for you, and we will put adjusted crude protein on your report. So anytime you're looking at your hay report and you have heat damage protein in a significant amount, and it causes the adjusted protein to be different than the crude protein, when you're balancing rations or building your supplements, you want to make sure you're going based off the adjusted crude protein number and not the crude protein number. So along with the heat damage, while that hay is in the field and it's getting rained on and it's wet, and you're waiting for it to dry out, you're trying not to put up wet hay and have a heat damage protein, you're going to be losing the soluble nutrients out of that forage. So anything that's water soluble, so certain carbohydrates, so a lot of the sugars are going to leave, some of the micronutrients, and some of the soluble protein is going to leave that plant. So looking at a comparison, so these are the grass forages that were analyzed at Ward Labs, and we're comparing 2024 to 2025. Now, what I do want to say is these numbers are diluted with samples that we received as fresh forages, because I just pulled straight from my NIR database. I didn't have time to go and get go into our Ward Labs database and pull out the dry matters on these. So I would have preferred to be showing you just hay, but this is actually across all the forage. So what you can see is, let me see if I can write on here. Yep. So in 2025, for adjusted crude protein, this is the proportion of samples that the adjusted crude protein was less than the crude protein. Okay, so about 9% of those samples. So that's a significant increase in samples that have less available protein, which means that we're going to need to consider supplementing more protein to meet their actual protein requirement. And then also when we're losing the solubles, I can't see my mouse, so I'm not going to draw, sorry. So when we're losing the solubles, what we're seeing, you might not necessarily see or have an application for, oh, I don't have as much sugar in my hay. We know sugar provides energy, so we know that we'll see it that way, but what we will also see is an increase in the proportion of fibers. So neutral detergent fiber at 65% approximately is where it starts to interfere with animal dry matter intake. So as we have higher fiber, it takes those gut rumen microbes longer to break down that fiber. And so as they're chewing on it, that means less time ruminating, or more time ruminating, excuse me, less time grazing or less time eating out of the bale feeder. And so they're not going to consume as much of that dry matter. So this had a huge jump from 25% of our forages in 2024 having NDF greater than 65% to nearly 50%. Almost half of our forages in 2025 had these high fiber values. And then with that, I estimate approximately the average neutral detergent fiber digestibility at 48 hours to be about 45%. And so sometimes you look at these numbers in combination when you're looking at your forage report. So you might have a high fiber value, but it might not actually impact dry matter intake if you also have high digestibility of that fiber. And so looking at NDF of less than 45%, we're looking at what's the proportion of samples that have low digestibility. And so you can see from 24 to 25, there's about 6% increase in samples that had less digestibility. And understand that these numbers are diluted within the fresh forages, right? So if we were to look at hay samples, things might be a little bit more pronounced, okay? So the point being, from 24 to 25, we're seeing a lot more samples that we need to be using the adjusted crude protein value. We're seeing higher fiber forages, and we're seeing less digestibility. Okay, and so then when these things are happening together, so in that first column, we're looking at samples with less available crude protein to the animal and higher fiber. So we go from 9% to 18%. So twice as many forage samples that we analyzed have both less available protein and high fiber that's going to impact animal intake. And then we see the same pattern essentially with samples that are high fiber as well as low digestibility. Okay, so now I just want to go through with you guys. So that's great. Those are the general numbers, but how does this apply to me? So if you're going through your specific report, and yes, this was submitted as a hay. I know it looks like a silage, but it was actually submitted as a hay sample. So with the moisture is 30% and the dry matter is 69%. So let's say we're wanting to feed this through the winter. We have 1,300 pound gestating beef cows. So I've got their protein requirements or end energy and dry matter intake requirements there on the right. So protein, we're wanting these animals to consume 7.3% protein, TDN 51% essentially, and then dry matter intake of 23 pounds per day. So first red flag, of course, is the moisture, since this was submitted as a hay sample. That's not good at all, obviously. And then we look at the crude protein, the heat damage protein, and available protein altogether. So there you can see crude protein was at 8%, but we actually lose a whole percentage point because of that heat damage and the calculation for the adjusted available protein. And so these cows are going to need a little bit of a protein supplement, but not too much. 7 is pretty close, right? But now when we look at our fibers, that's a big red flag because our neutral detergent fiber is at 80%. That's so high. It's definitely going to be interfering with dry matter intake, honestly, at that point, regardless of the digestibility, but you can see the digestibility is also low. And so then also, of course, our TDN is below because of those high fibers and because of the lack of protein availability there. I would guess, things got washed out. So this is where it's at. So we're going to need a significant amount of energy to meet these requirements. Okay, so looking at another report, just another example, but the same group of cattle, just another report. So again, moisture was a red flag, 20%, right there between the 18 and 22% moisture. Crude protein and available protein. Again, the crude protein, we would have said, oh, we don't need to supplement. But when we look at the available protein, we see, we do need a little bit of a protein supplement to meet their requirements. Now on this sample, the forage values or the fiber values actually look good. So the NDF is less than 65 and the NDF, and sometimes I say 60, it kind of just depends. It's relative. It's not hard and fast on the fiber, and the digestibility is above average. So I wouldn't worry too much about her intake being affected. So that's a good thing. But the TDN is still low. So we still need some protein supplementation and then definitely some energy supplementation to meet these requirements. Now, this is another thing I like to do as kind of an exercise to help you understand, because this kind of helped me to understand what was going on. So when we visualize as a pie chart, so on the left, that's the first sample that we looked at, and then on the right is the second sample we looked at. So what you can see is that those non-structural carbohydrates, those non-structural carbohydrates are only 4% in the sample, the first sample, and then 17% in the second sample. And you can see that that's kind of what's driving that proportion of the NDF to be more or less. And that's what's affecting the TDN value as well. So, it's just kind of a good way for you to see if the bigger that NDF slice is, the orange slice, the less energy, and the more it's like the first sample is like celery, whereas the second sample is, it's not quite a candy bar, but it's more like a little bit more like eating a sandwich if you were to think about human nutrition, right? So celery, they say that you actually burn more calories chewing it, right? Because of all the fiber. My mouse. Okay, so with that, I just wanted to share a couple of articles. So one is I wrote in Progressive Forage about exactly what we just went over. So if you want to kind of have a hard copy of that or refresh or have that as a reference. And then the other one is an article in Hay and Forage Grower by their senior editor, Mike Rankin. And he talks about how with a lot of this heat damage protein and heat damage hay, there will be a really nice tobacco-y smell. It'll almost smell sweet. And that's all the caramelized sugars. And the cows actually love eating that. And so in some cases with the heat damage hay, dry matter intake will increase. And so that's something to be on the lookout for is, yep, their dry matter intake increases, but if they're not meeting the requirements because the protein's not available to them and the fiber's not digestible, you may need to double rethink how you're feeding that and how you're managing that. So, okay, so we've kind of gone over understanding the rained-on hay. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about winter grazing. So first we're going to go over native pasture and rangeland versus managed and the effects of weather on the forage value, and then how does snow cover affect all of this. So with native pasture and rangeland, you're a lot more at the mercy of, your location, your what's out there. Of course we can manage rangeland somewhat, but for the most part it's going to be native plants, so you have less control over what's out there, and there are just so many factors that are going to impact the forage quality. So it's going to be important to test that and just make sure you know what you're feeding before just letting cattle out there. And then also another thing I got a lot of questions on this year, we did see more, different types of toxic weeds. I'm not a weed specialist, but that's something as cattlemen we should be aware of, walking out our fields and being aware of those. So your forage quality is going to depend essentially on your location, your elevation, precipitation, all of that kind of thing. Invasive species. So I don't think cheatgrass is much of a big deal here in Nebraska, but I know in Wyoming and Montana, invasive species like cheatgrass can lower your forage quality. So being aware of what's out in those fields is going to be important, as well as, the testing as much as you can. With managed pastures, so there's a lot more we can do with that. We can plant things, we can apply fertilizer. Maybe you did that, in the summer. When you are looking at maybe things that voluntarily came up, I heard a lot about that with sorghum as well as millets, people having volunteer stuff come up. So in that case, we need to be aware of nitrates. We also need to be aware of the fact that these plants are essentially hitting it's almost like a second spring coming up. And so they may not have all the micronutrients that we would want them to have, such as magnesium being one. Now we aren't the timing isn't typically going to be coinciding with lactation unless you're a fall calving operation, I guess, then it would be. So you might be wanting to consider feeding a high mag mineral. So, and then you also have more options for management of that forage. So now that it's out there standing, you could have windrowed it. That is a good way to preserve some of the forage quality. I think we're kind of past that at this point. But if you have some dry pastures that, maybe you could still. Okay, so I already hit on the weeds, potentially other toxins and other nitrate issues. So, and in managed pastures, I heard a lot about nightshade this year too, which I've noticed that weed does seem to be one that comes up when we do have more wet years. So the effects of weather. So the wind and the precipitation on the, so if your forage is out there standing and it's just completely exposed to the wind, it's completely exposed to the rain or the snow, what have you. Of course, that's going to damage the leafy material. The leafy material is really where the protein's at. So you might end up with a stand that's more fiber and less protein. So making sure we're properly supplementing in those situations. And then looking at snow cover. So snow cover can actually protect forages. Of course, I haven't seen that anywhere that, maybe I don't know what's going on in the whole state. Of course I don't. But around here, there isn't any snow cover. If we would have gotten some snow cover after having a nice wet fall, where we had some of that volunteer forage coming up, that can kind of protect the forage from the wind. And animals can actually graze through quite a bit of snow cover. But right now, I think we've been pretty dry. So this is not something that's super relevant at the moment. Okay. All right, so we went over some of the opportunities and cautions with winter grazing. We've covered wet hay. So now with the wet growing season, let's take a look at our mycotoxins in our grains. So what I'm going to cover here is why and when to test for mycotoxins, and then I'm going to talk about what specific guidance we do have for individual mycotoxins, which actually is not a lot, and then some examples of what our lab has seen this year with the wetter growing season and things like that. So why we want to test for mycotoxins. So mycotoxins are a specific type of toxin that is produced by mold, which is a fungus. And it needs to be a wet and hot condition. There are some that grow up wet and cool conditions. But for the most part, wet and hot. So kind of like the summer that we had. And then the thing is, there's economic losses because of just poor performing animals. So a lot of times mycotoxin symptoms won't be clear. It'll just be kind of like things just aren't going so well. Animals just aren't thrifty. And in extreme cases, you'll start to see the reproductive effects and the effects on respiratory illness as well. And so the other thing to think about too is that mycotoxins can be passed on through meat, eggs. I know that obviously that's not something with cattlemen, but it also protecting yourself, just breathing in mycotoxins and things like that on your farm consistently, that's not going to be good for you either. Because it's a human health risk as well as animal. So when to test. So coming out of the field is a great time to test because then you know a baseline of where you're starting. And then coming out of storage is the other time to test. So basically in the fall as you come out of the field and in the spring as you're pulling grains out of storage, or during the winter as you're pulling grains out of the storage to feed. Because some of the mycotoxins can increase during storage. So out of the field gets you a baseline, so you'll kind of understand where your risk levels are at, and then pulling out of storage will make sure that you know if you need to do anything for additional feed management. Okay. So the first mycotoxin I'm going to talk a little bit about is aflatoxin, and this is the most prevalent mycotoxin, and so it's the one that you've probably been the most familiar with and have heard the most about. So this is one that does increase during storage, and we also do have FDA guidance on it. So you can see, but it's measured in parts per billion, so that's actually pretty small. So even though those numbers like less than 300, but that's parts per billion. So it's not something you're going to detect by using, sight and smell, but looking at your corn in the field, corn grain in the field or coming out of the bin is going to be good because it does produce in an olive green. The fungus that produces it is more of an olive green. And so seeing mold on your grains, especially your corn, is going to be a good indicator that you need to get this test done. So vomitoxin's another one. We most often hear about it in swine because it makes them throw up. That's why it's called vomitoxin or DON. But it is something that can affect cattle too. And it increases in the field under cool temperatures and wet growing conditions. So we have seen some of this, and we'll go over that a bit later. And this is another one that is prevalent enough to have FDA guidance on how much to feed for it. Fumonisin. So this one we do have FDA guidance on. Zearalenone, we don't have FDA guidance on, but we did find it really interesting. We were at CattleCon last year. We were able to sit down and we actually had lunch with some regulatory people on the regulatory side. And what's interesting about zearalenone is if you're on a natural plan and you're saying you don't use implants, sometimes zearalenone will be in the feed. And since it has such an impact on the endocrine system, it will show up as though your animals did have an implant, and it would actually be coming from this zearalenone in the feed. So if you're doing all natural, this might be a good reason to test. If you are just having issues with reproduction and it's like you can't put your finger on it, this could be one of the culprits. So ochratoxin, this is important as a human health risk. This is one that can be passed on through meat, and it actually causes kidney and liver damage. So if this is getting into your cow herd, it might affect your cow performance and their longevity and ability to stay in the herd. We don't have FDA guidance on this one. And then T2 is also actually one of the most virulent of them all, and it also comes up during wet conditions in the field. and we don't have FDA guidance on it. Okay, so some examples of what we've seen in our lab, and I wasn't able to compile our data, just the timing of everything. But this is an example of a report. So the aflatoxin on this one was good. We didn't have an aflatoxin issue, but we definitely had a vomitoxin issue, well above the FDA guideline. Fumonisin was low but present, so that's a co-occurrence. And with these mycotoxins, when they co-occur at lower levels, their virulence and impact on the animal increases. So ochratoxin was not detected. Zearalenone was detected, again, a co-occurrence here, a co-occurrence issue then again with the T2. So the management for this corn, it needs to be diluted, and it needs to be diluted quite a bit with corn that's not impacted with these mycotoxins. And so then same thing here with this one, aflatoxin was good. But I would recommend, if the producer had put these up, that they would need to retest again and make sure that that aflatoxin stays low. Vomitoxin, again, above the FDA guideline. Fumonisin was pretty dang high. And so not only is it above the FDA guideline, but it also was a co-occurrence, which we saw a lot of. More co-occurrence with zearalenone and T2. So these are posing a risk to animal health and animal production, and ultimately the bottom line for the cattlemen that are trying to utilize these corn grains as feed. So going back to this one, the reason this one actually was tested with us is because it was rejected by the elevators for fumonisin, which is a story that I heard a lot this year. So just know if your corn was rejected from the elevator because of fumonisin, and you're planning on just keeping it back and feeding it, you probably do need to test it first to make sure you can figure out what to do with it next to ensure your animals remain healthy and productive. Because just because the elevator found fumonisin, there may be other things going on as well. Okay, so then DDGs. So this is one where I got called. I've been getting questions. In Iowa, some of the ethanol plants have rejected loads of corn for vomitoxin and fumonisin risks. And through the ethanol plant process, just like when we think of those feeds being high in phosphorus or sulfur, that process can concentrate the mycotoxins. Now, for the most part, we have not seen, everything was below the FDA guidelines on this sample. We have not seen an issue with the DDGs because the ethanol plants are rejecting loads that are contaminated. So we're not seeing those issues. As we move further away from growing season, and they may have to start accepting some contamination in order to continue with production, this may be something we want to keep an eye on before feeding our animals. So that essentially covers everything I had planned to cover. So with your hay that you had to unfortunately put up wet, keep an eye on your dry matter, your heat damage proteins, your fibers, and your other solubles and micronutrients to make sure that you're going to supplement properly. If you're going to be using some opportunistic winter grazing, be aware of the pros and the cons with that. And I didn't talk too much about, but we also want to think about these pastures recovering in the spring too. So we definitely we want to take advantage of the extra forage, but we don't want to cause more damage and harm than it's worth. And then with our wet growing season, our corn grain, more of it may be compromised than what we really understand. And we want to definitely test that and make sure we're keeping our animals healthy and productive and managing everything accordingly. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you, Bonita, for having me on. You can scan the QR code if anyone wants to get started with some sampling. And then if you need to contact me, there's my email, rkern@wardlab.com. You can also call me. Looks like I put the direct number for myself on. Oh, that's my direct number. And then it looks like that's Stephanie's direct number. So Stephanie's our microbiologist on staff. So if you have questions about the mycotoxin issue, she's a good contact as well. So.
Are there any questions? I didn't see any in the chat box or the Q&A box. Please feel free to give Rebecca a phone call if you do have questions. I do want to thank you guys for joining us today. Just a reminder that we are going to try and start hosting our Cattle Edge webinars monthly. So do watch your Insider, our social media for information on those webinars. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Have a great day and we will see you soon.
Thanks, Bonita.
Thank you.